Okay. Having technical difficulties still, but we'll muddle on through. So Hannah's raising this interesting point about, and let me see if I'm just following you here. You're wondering why their beliefs wouldn't be rational, assuming they're based on what they take to be their evidence.
Right.
Yeah.
Also, I mean, this brings up the point of RA. Isn't like something like that you're giving special status to your beliefs, and that's kind of irrational because you're saying I have evidence that supports this, and you have evidence that supports that, but I'm going to give special status to my evidence, even though you have.
Yeah, we'll get to that. That's the very last one. That's kind of the most complicated one of all. Well, let's just start with some of the easier ones, because I think there's enough here. Hopefully my musings and ramblings have provoked you guys to think a little bit about this. So again, he's trying to come up with different formulations, different versions, and I encourage you to do this in your own writing, at least when you're writing philosophy papers. If you're struggling with a way to get started, you might say there's just 4 different things this might mean, and let's just lay them out and identify each of them very clearly. It makes it easier for discussion. So the first one here, what one person knows might differ from what another person knows. Yeah, it seems like it does all the time. And that's life. Different people know different things. There's no conflict with evidentialism there, right? That seems okay. What one person knows at one time might differ from what that person knows at another time. So we've got people knowing different things at the same time and at different times, and we've got an individual person knowing different things at different times. Yeah, Ian?
Just like what's happening here, like what I thought was interesting about this chapter is we're talking about formulating, like you said, what this could mean, this relativism, and already when you read, like half of the chapter is just he's presenting things that aren't really, they're not presenting any significant challenge to the accepted norm. So for this case particularly, epistemic relativism, it seems that there's having a lot of difficulty with pinning down just exactly what it is and how it branches off from the normal absolutist standard.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, as I say, it's a hard view to kind of get a handle on, since relativists kind of beat around the bush. It seems they don't. He tries. Feldman gives a few quotes here that you can. Here's. I'll just start with what Swivl says in the very beginning of the chapter. Epistemological relativism may be defined as the view that knowledge and/or truth is relative to time, to place, to society, to culture, to historical epoch, to conceptual scheme or framework, or to personal training or conviction, so that what counts as knowledge depends upon the values of one or more of these variables. So there's a quote. Now, of course, Harvey Swivl doesn't go and try to formulate the thesis the way Feldman does here. And I think it's good as an exercise in part to sort of see how you can try to take a prose passage or some sort of expansive claim and then try to narrow it down and tighten it up into something that's either interesting and controversial or conflicts with evidentialism. You can see the trouble we're getting. So none of us has an issue with R1 or R2. Those are not that interesting, not that controversial. What about R3? What is generally known in one society might differ from what's generally known in another society. Everybody's taken some anthropology. Different societies know different things. So yeah, what's controversial about that? I guess so. Part of my sort of move here is to provoke you to think about, say, that passage from Swivl and see if what he's getting at. What is it that he's trying to say that it's supposed to be conflicting with absolutism, whatever that may be. I'm just assuming evidentialism counts as an absolutist view, since it presumably it can take into consideration time and persons and cultures and beliefs and ideologies and all of these things. I don't see that there's an issue there as long as we keep the questions distinct. The real issue is you're evaluating some person and their belief in a statement or a proposition, trying to decide whether or not the belief is rational. Now, here would be something maybe that would conflict if you thought that the standards for rationality actually shifted. We're getting a little closer to something like that maybe when we get to the next one here, R4. What's generally known in one society at one time might differ from what's generally known, or further down, R5 rather. So R1 through 4, nothing to write home about there. R5, the correct or reasonable system or principles performing beliefs for one person or group can be different from the correct or reasonable system for another. So we get some different examples. I think this is where, R5, we get the two teachers example. Somebody want to read that one for us? It's over on 179, just to get it out there. And I think the examples are helpful because we've got to put some flesh on the bones of these different schemas, these different proposals. So this allows us to sort of, at least, they're simple, but they're helpful. Yeah, Ian, thanks.
So, Professor Expert is a distinguished scholar in her field. In her classes, she presents detailed and accurate lectures on the course material. Students listen carefully to things she says, and unless something highly unusual occurs, accept her word. Professor Provocative is also a distinguished scholar in his field, but in his classes, he typically says outrageous things in order to provoke students into thinking through the material. Students listen carefully to things he says, and unless something highly unusual occurs, they reject what he says.
Okay. So, looks like they've got two different sets of principles or systems for how they form their beliefs. The one set of students listens and believes what the professor says, and the other one doesn't. So, what's the problem there for evidentialism? There doesn't seem to be one. I take it.
I don't get it. I don't know if I missed something with the example, because that's like saying if I'm fishing, we should do this, and if I'm going skydiving, I should do this. It's like two unrelated things, because you take into your environment, and your total evidence says you should do X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
I think I'm missing something.
Ian, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I'm also having difficulty understanding what this an example is trying to illustrate from the relativist point of view, because like the previous stuff I was talking about, this doesn't seem like it really presents any challenge. It's like he said, it's two different things kind of. It's not. It's I don't understand.
Skydiving and fishing. There we go. Yeah. Well, yeah, I get it. Yeah, and I think that's part of the point of this is to try. If somebody says, what I mean, I'm a relativist and I think that knowledge is relative or justification is relative, it varies from group to group or person to person or from time and place, then we've got to figure out if that's something that evidentialism can or can't accept. And so here's one idea, that what the reasonable system or the correct set of principles for one group are going to be different than the correct set of principles for another group. And it seems like in the case of, so these two sets of students have these different principles for how they deal with what the teacher says. And they're different because the one generally believes the teacher and the other set of principles says generally don't trust the teacher. It looks like so they're coming up with different normative principles for what you ought to do depending on which teacher you've got. And it seems like that's not a problem because each of them's doing the right thing under their circumstances. So again, we haven't really found anything that's presenting a real challenge to evidentialism at this point. I think R6 takes us a little further, and it's starting to get a little more menacing. Here's a quote that I'll read you from over on 180. For the relativists, there is no sense attached to the idea that some standards or beliefs are really rational as distinct from merely locally accepted as such, because he thinks that there are no context-free or supercultural norms of rationality. He does not see rationality and irrationality irrationally held beliefs as making up two distinct and qualitatively different classes of things. And that's kind of a one to think about. And so the idea here is what we're getting in R6. More challenging, for sure. No standards or beliefs are really rational, distinct from whatever's merely locally accepted. So I don't know if this is kind of what you had in mind, Hannah, or not.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah, that's the feeling I was getting.
I get the reason not to accept it just because, like, if they're basing it on the evidence that's in front of them, like, granted, they might be wrong based on the evidence that we have, but because it's not available to them, like...
They're still following their
yeah,
evidence.
so where does it come in that, like, what do we, like, decide evidence is, and when is it enough to be, like, a belief?
Yeah. No, thanks. I appreciate it. I think that's what this is, what we're trying to decide. There are hard issues here, I think, with R6. Feldman's got some interesting stuff to say about it. This idea that there's, this is over on 181, he writes, one might be led to think that there is nothing that is really rational because everyone who thinks about the matter will address the issue from his or her own perspective or context. There is no privileged vantage point from which to view things. Whatever you think about rationality will be affected by your experiences, your culture, and other factors. So again, I think that's part of what's kind of motivating folks who claim to be relativist about rationality or justification. And they may think the same thing is the case with truth. You could be a relativist about truth and think that truth itself isn't it's not an objective feature of reality, that it's some sort of subjective or relativistic account of truth. I'm not saying that's where we want to go, but I think folks that are sympathetic to this sort of stuff, that like this, would maybe want to go down that path as well. Where that leads, I leave it to you to sort of think about. You know, so again, different. Take Aztec society and then contemporary American society, very different societies, different cultures, different sets of beliefs. Is it somehow judgmental or imperialistic or authoritarian or some other bad thing for us to have a theory of justification that allows us to assess the rationality of those other people's beliefs, given that we're not those people. We're not in their culture. We're not in their time. You know, that's something that just kind of comes to mind. I wonder, I mean, I don't do anthropology, but I've taken some anthropology a long time ago, and I do think that a lot of folks interested in cultural anthropology and sociology and maybe history, coming from those backgrounds, from those disciplines, are probably going to be a lot more sympathetic to the idea that, well, look, they have their beliefs and we've got our beliefs, and you can't really judge other people's beliefs. They're embedded in a context and a perspective, and so what if the things they thought were evidence for their views turned out not really to be evidence? That's just your opinion, or that's just your point of view. It's only not evidence because it's not what you take to be evidence. That seems to be kind of where Hannah's pretty sympathetic. I don't know that, you know, what do other people think? And again, I think this is timely in a way. It's relevant for us to be thinking about this. More people probably need to be thinking about this, given what's going on in the world.
But it's something that's happened for thousands of years.
What's happened for thousands? People passing judgment on other people's beliefs from outside of their context or their culture?
I mean, the Spanish did it, the English did it, so many different cultures came in and took over other cultures based upon what culture that they were taking over the lead. They thought they were barbaric,
Right. Primitive.
colonizing.
Sure.
You know, but it wasn't the point of fact that they came in and said, hey, we're going to sympathize with you, we're going to empathize with you, we're going to work with you, and
We're going to respect your beliefs or your belief systems. Yeah.
Work along with you. It was just, they're barbaric, take them over, destroy them, or whatever, and take what they have, or take their land, or whatever.
Right.
So this is something that has been happening for thousands of years.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, like, how's that a problem for evidentialism? I'm with you. I mean, because the facts are the facts, right? You're just recounting, the history of kind of how we've, how things have been, unfortunate history, sad history. But again, we're still struggling to sort of figure out how does all of this bear on whether or not their beliefs are rational as judged from our perspective. Can we do that? Is that arrogant to do that?
Yeah, I think we're jump to number 8.
Okay, we're getting there. We're ramping up to it.
The thing is like with evidentialism, I guess I was
Well, okay, yeah. Corey.
Yeah, I mean, because like, isn't A1 like kind of like a corollary to R6?
Yeah.
Because wouldn't that like that?
So this becomes that's one of Feldman's points, whether you think that's a strong point or not. It looks like if R6 is true, then it's really then some form of absolutism actually really is true, which is it's always really rational for a person to conform to whatever the local standards are. This is kind of when in Rome, do as the Romans sort of thing, but with respect to forming beliefs,
Yeah,
forming policies.
But what if that culture's views are, if I have evidence to support something, you actually should disbelieve it?
Yeah, that's the problem, right?
Yeah.
It's that people conform. You can imagine, and as he points out, it seems like a pretty implausible absolutist theory. R6 is, yeah.
But if you're doing that, like if you're going to a place where you would be expected, or like it would make more sense for you to adapt to their beliefs, but you don't want to, or like you don't think you should because of your evidence, why is your evidence better than theirs? Like what makes what you think better than what they think just because you're coming from an outside perspective?
Yeah, I'm glad you're saying this.
And I don't think that it needs to be like so drastic as like you're going to the middle of nowhere and like, a very like concealed like whatever, but even like across the United States, this is like a thing.
The regional differences,
Yeah,
you mean? And
I'm not from here, and when I moved here, I had to adapt to like what North Carolinians do. So like, there is a difference, even though they're minor. It's like still a cultural difference across the country.
yeah, okay, thanks. I'm just wondering, I mean, did different things suddenly, things that weren't rational for you to believe, suddenly they became reasonable or rational for you to believe in the relevant sense? Because it's easy, again, to get kind of shifted off in thinking about behavior and whether or not you conform to the local customs because it's a matter of etiquette or it's a polite thing to do, it's respectful. I think we can separate that stuff off, like Ian was saying before, and that just kind of, again, how you treat people and tolerance and respect, that's one set of issues, but that's not the same as thinking they're right. I mean, I have colleagues, friends, family members, bump into folks all the time, just like each of you do in the world, who you respect and you appreciate and value, but you disagree. That's why this is, again, this chapter is an interesting chapter in a way. This whole thing about reasonable disagreements people like to sort of throw that phrase around that reasonable people can disagree. Yeah.
I mean, with kind of what you were saying, I took it a little more extreme. Like I thought of an example, you have like two cultures. In one culture, they think that the moon is made of cheese, and then the culture you came from is the moon. They say the moon is made of Jello, and each have their respective scientists that like say, no, we've done research, and the moon's definitely made of Jello or definitely made of cheese. Like, what makes that right? And at the end of the day, like one faction will be right, like epistemically, because like
if they're really disagreeing.
Yeah.
If there's a genuine disagreement. So that's a whole other kind of thing that happens. A lot of times people, especially when it comes to, as Feldman points out, things that typically arouse people's passions. So if it's something about morality, about what's right and wrong, if it's something about politics, if it's something having to do with religious matters, oftentimes, you'll find lots of disagreement. People disagree over these things endlessly. And one of the things you first have to kind of figure out is whether or not there's a genuine disagreement or not. By genuine disagreement, I mean a case where one person believes P is true and the other person believes that not P is true. That's a real disagreement because one of them, that's, principle of non-contradiction. You say they're both right, you end up with a contradiction. And presumably we don't want to give that up. Though some people have considered what would happen if we did. And maybe the kind of people the folks that are really sympathetic to this are already really softened up to it. They may not have the same convictions about logic or give logic the same weight or think that, they may not want to have some sort of paraconsistent logic or something. Who knows? But in any case, yeah, so a lot of times it might look like there's a disagreement when there's not really one. People are just talking past each other. They're saying, you can imagine, and Feldman makes a brief little reference to this, when it comes to, say, theological language, religious matters, a lot of times people might say, well, religious language is special. It's not just factive. It doesn't work. It's not intended to be purely descriptive. It's intended to do something else. And so when one person says that God exists and another person denies it, or when they start debating some finer points of theology, let's say from different theological perspectives or from different religions altogether, one way to try to handle that would be to say, well, the language is what's throwing us off here. That in fact we're not really disagreeing. It's just that our natural languages are inadequate to express these supernatural ideas or these theological notions. And if we can just see that, then maybe there's not a real disagreement going on. But if that's not what, and Feldman doesn't take up that line, he doesn't pursue the idea that religious language is special. The same thing's been claimed. Philosophers have tried to do this with ethics as well. In the 20th century, some moral philosophers have suggested that moral discourse is not factive. In other words, the view is called non-cognitivism, and it's a kind of moral anti-realism as well. The idea that moral properties aren't moral language, moral predicates don't express properties in the same way that our scientific language, just to have something to contrast it with, does, or our ordinary everyday properties. So being round or being human, being composed of atoms, those are all real properties. But being morally right, being morally wrong, being morally responsible, maybe those aren't predicates that express genuine properties. So that language is doing something else. And the suggestion, and then they go on to say different things about what the language is really doing. Maybe it's giving vent to some sort of pro-attitude. It's expressing, it's emotive. It's kind of like cheering at a sporting event. It's like saying, hooray. That's not true or false. That's just a performative thing. Yeah, Ian?
Feldman kind of beats around the bush a little bit. He introduces in the beginning, like you said, a couple supposed relativistic statements that aren't really that big a challenge. But if you get to the end of the issue, if there's a statement like a truth value, we're talking about the truth. If it's a fact, and you both have the same evidence, you can't both be epistemically justified in believing in different things if there's a truth value to it. If we're not, and I think if he were to, and of course, I think either one side is right and one side is wrong. In cases like that, it's not relativist. Both of them are. There can't be disagreement the way that a relativist would want to. So if there's a truth value,
Yeah.
you have the same evidence. One, they both can't, and they have contradictory beliefs about it. They can't both be right. If that's a relativistic claim, if that's what they're trying to say, then at the end of the day, that's too. It just doesn't work.
Okay. Yeah. No. Thanks.
But, obviously, you wouldn't have much of a chapter if you don't get into that. But
yeah, it takes some doing to get to the heart of it all at the very end here. But I mean, yeah, and we'll talk about R7 and 8 here in a second and read some of the examples. But I just thought R6 is where it starts to get, especially since Hannah and maybe other folks as well seem a little sympathetic to this idea that rationale, when we try to assess one another's beliefs in terms of whether they're rational or irrational, justified or unjustified, we're coming at it from a certain perspective. We're embedded within a context, within a perspective of some sort. And people that are not in that context don't share that perspective. It's apples and oranges. We can't apply our sort of norms, our norms of reason to them. And Derek seems a little sympathetic to this idea, maybe, or not. You're not so sure. Okay. Yeah. I mean, and again, I put this out there for you to think about. That's the whole point of it. I mean, you can read and have what Feldman's got to say about it. He's not a huge fan. Doesn't seem to think that there's much of real philosophical interest or value unless we get down to, say, 8, where it looks like, and that's sort of where I take it Ian is that you've got a statement that it really does express a proposition, a thing that could be true or false. It's not doing something else. It's not figurative or allegorical or metaphor or any other kind of language. And you've got a body of evidence that each person has, and they look at this evidence and they draw different conclusions, and they've shared all this with each other. Then can they both be right? And you're saying no. Yeah.
Like, especially if there's, like, you have someone, two people in a room, and they're like looking at a cup or something,
Yeah.
and they both have the same evidence. And in really specific cases like that, and of course, it's obvious to see that there's just not any, you can't have any reasonable disagreement about that. If one of them says there's no cup on the table, and one of them says there is, and they both have the same evidence, they're both in the same room, in close proximity, then there just can't be any, they can't both be right there. There's truth value to that statement, and there can't be any significant disagreement. And if we're talking about, you can have disagreement in places like ethics or whatever, if you take the view that it's not expressing any truth values, if
it's not doing that.
True or false.
Right. But even there, you think if it is fact, if the language works just like it works in every other area, then those ethical disagreements are going to work the same way. Somebody's going to be justified in their view and somebody's not. Yeah. Did I see a hand?
Yeah, I just feel like for relativism to actually stand on its own and not be so beat around the bush, there has to be a definition of what evidence is. Because what's the difference between reasonable disagreement and just suspending judgment?
I think yeah, good. So, and Feldman comes to that conclusion in the end, right? That in a lot of cases, suspension is probably what's warranted. If it's really the case that each person's they've shared all of their evidence, and they're inclined to draw different conclusions from the exact same body of evidence, then either maybe they should just suspend judgment about it. That's a possibility, and people don't like that as much. Now, in terms of Ian's example with the cup on the table, one point there is that somebody might say, well, even in these kind of simple, non-controversial seeming perceptual cases, the visual experience you're having and the visual experience that I'm having you've got your evidence and I've got mine. If it really does look from my perspective like it's not on the table, and it really does look from your perspective like it is, then sure, there's a fact of the matter. The cup's either on the table or it's not. We know that. But you could be justified in your belief that it is, and I could be justified in my belief that it's not, because we're not dealing with the same evidence. So I think maybe this is kind of circling back around to Hannah's point about, well, what in the world, what makes something evidence to start with? I mentioned this last time. I haven't given an account of that. Feldman doesn't try to do that. And that's at the bottom of a lot of this. Why we look at the Aztec culture, they have a practice of human sacrifice. We find it, abhorrent and morally, revolting. They've got their beliefs about what doing that will bring about in their society, and those beliefs, according to their way of thinking, are rational for them. They need the sun god to make the weather better for the crops. We would look at this and think, well, their beliefs are irrational because they're not based on any evidence. They're just, But from their perspective, it's not like that, of course. So then a lot of this, again, these issues come back up. Is evidentialism somehow committed to saying, as an absolutist view, that the bottom line is that we can, as anthropologists, we can try to understand their culture and their beliefs and why they thought the way they did. But at the end of the day, those are just irrational beliefs, not because they're not following their evidence, because they just didn't have evidence for thinking those things are true. That sacrificing people makes the weather better later on. Yeah, Ian.
Well, you mentioned about the earlier example, about the simple example of the couple on the table.
Mm-hmm.
And we both have evidence. You have perceptual evidence based on your perception that it's not. And obviously there's a truth value either. It's either on the table or it's not.
Right.
And I have,
so one of us is wrong.
One of us is
Right.
wrong.
But we're both justified.
But what if you're like, well, my perception is working fine right now, and it's working as it should, and I see it's on the table, and if you say that it's not, then yours must be be sick or something, so
Yeah.
you're no longer justified in believing that evidence, because the system you're using, your method of giving the evidence is so screwed up that really it's not justified anymore. And that's the only way, if you could, for a simple proposition like the cup is on the table, that's the only way you can have different evidence that you're so...
Or my system's just, what if his system's just working differently? Like, it's not that you might think, well, look, there's the proper functioning kind of thing. There's a way the system's supposed to work. And I'm sympathetic to what you're saying. So there must be something about your system that's either not functioning properly, or and so you have that belief about what's going on with me as a way of trying to explain why I've reached this different conclusion. To try to make it a harder case, maybe when the systems just don't, they're different systems. Like we're members of the same species, and so I see the point. But suppose you've got some other being, you've got an alien being, you've got a robot, you've got something that isn't. Then it might be the case that it's actually functioning as it was supposed to, as it was designed. Now, clearly, you could still say, well, it's getting a lot of false beliefs as a result of the way it's designed to work, so it doesn't work very well. Maybe that's the point to make. Yeah, I started to see a hand, Hannah.
I think that proper functionalism can be relative. Like, I don't think that the word proper necessarily means that we're all supposed to work in the same way. I think it can mean that we see things in like a relative point of view. So like the two different, like the cup is on the table, the cup isn't on the table.
Yeah.
They both will be functioning, and they both could be properly functioning, but that doesn't mean that anything is like necessarily wrong.
So it sounds like you and Ian are really kind of on different sides of this thing here.
You just said a good response to that.
Yeah.
If the method of acquiring the evidence, even if it's properly designed, is working as it's designed, it's a poor design, and it's getting wrong.
Lots of false beliefs. So,
then you're no longer justified. That machine is very poorly designed, and it could have no justified beliefs because of the poor design. It is poor. It is designed or working like it should, but it's not doing what it should be.
So, what about a case where, man, I'm trying to think of a case where one person has sensory capacities that another person doesn't, and they're disagreeing over a claim.
So like a superhuman and a human.
Yeah. So some being that can see, parts of the spectrum we can't, perceives an aura and says, there's a whatever aura around the cup, and you look, no, there's not. So again, we've got different evidence, presumably.
Well.
So it's not a case where you've got the same evidence and you're both justified in believing different things.
Well, I mean, if there's a truth value to the statement, there's an aura there, just because you don't have the capacity to see it.
Yeah.
Either the aura is there or it's not. And if the superhuman being can perceive the aura and it really is there, they're just better and they're right and we're wrong.
It's the same example though, because if it's the other way around, if it's someone who can't see it and then someone who can see it, that's the same example as a human versus a superhuman. There's just the word super in front of the other person's moniker. It's the same exact.
I'm going to step back and let you guys fight it out. Yeah. No, I mean.
You could say it's a human and then a lesser human, but it would be the same example.
Derek and Hannah seem like they're kind of on the same page a little bit, and then Ian, I'm not taking sides. I want you all to like me. I'm suspending judgment. Yeah, I'm a neutral third party here. I'm going to let you guys think about it. So, I mean, just to move us a little bit forward here. So, I think that it seems like there's some folks that are kind of sympathetic to R6, though it's sort of, when you think about it, expressed as A1, as a version of absolutism, as Corey said before, it does seem like a kind of a bad version of absolutism, given that, folks can have, different groups of people can have, pretty bad practices epistemically that are part of their local customs. So whenever your evidence supports believing P, this particular local custom is to believe the denial, believe the negation. That seems like a pretty implausible version of absolutism. The last two are where it gets a little bit more interesting, I guess. So R7, it's possible for a person to be justified in believing P while also being justified in believing that other people are justified in believing not P. This gets us over. So he sets this up. This is about 183, where he says, so here's the maintaining your beliefs in light of disagreement. So here are the three claims. You have good reasons for your beliefs. They have good reasons for their competing beliefs. So there's a real disagreement, let's suppose. You're right and they're wrong. So this is the sort of, is this combination of claims defensible? And I think this is where people get kind of provoked to oftentimes and get sort of sidetracked by some of these other things that I've mentioned before. It's the idea that one side's right and the other side's wrong, and that's why he takes a minute to explain why that claim has to be part of it all. Yeah.
Is he writing this based on a supplement to the standard view, or is he just talking about relativism sitting on its own? Because you can say that the standard view is mostly acceptable, except for the 2 or 3 that are relative, like religion and.
Okay, yeah, so I see. I think I see what you're getting at. So would the idea be that objectivity prevails in pretty much every area, and the language is factive or whatever? Or maybe we can keep that factive part of the language, and even in religion and morality, but for some reason those areas just don't function the same way. Or here's what I mean. I want to wait and see what you guys think. I could say something, but. Yes, I think this is a view that some people want to hold. So this is kind of, I guess the question back to you is, well, what's the difference with religion and morality or political views?
The evidence isn't as concrete as the other factions of the standard view. So there's a difference between math and logic, and then
morality.
The Bible or something else.
Yeah, and if the relativists are saying you can have reasonable disagreements on statements with a truth value, like 2 + 2 = 4,
Yeah.
and you both have the same evidence for believing that 2 + 2 is 4, there can be no reasonable disagreement. That's what the relativists are saying. I don't even know what the relativists are saying
Because we don't know what relativism is. Yeah.
I still don't have a clear idea of even what's going on because it's hard to pin down exactly what the relativistic view would say and how it would be and how it would contradict the standard view. But if at the end of the day what the relativists are saying, if there is a truth value, you have the same evidence, there can't both be right.
And if a relativist is saying, if that's what they mean, then they're wrong.
Yeah.
Then they're wrong, and it's at odds with evidentialism.
If that is indeed what the relativists are proposing, then that's acceptable.
Well, again, I think it's a timely discussion. It's fun. It's fun. It's frustrating. It's important stuff to think about because we live in a time now more than ever where the facts are up for grabs, and it's the post-factual era, right? There's the fake news, and there are a lot of social issues, a lot of things happening where different groups of people look at presumably the same stuff. They draw radically different conclusions. So people, look, just watch the video. Well, the problem is everybody watches the video, and we still can't get people to agree on what's going on, as if that's just going to settle it. And this is part of the frustration, I think. So this, again, I'm not taking sides. I think it's good for us to sort of puzzle about this stuff. I think, Ian, did you have a follow-up here? I think you're right. I mean, you're basically just summarizing what Feldman concludes at the end about R8. But let's just think about R7 and R first. So what about this one? Possible for a person to be justified in believing what they believe, while also being justified in believing that other people are justified in believing the opposite. Now, he actually thinks that this isn't a problem. You can get cases like that.
Yeah, I don't see a problem. I don't see a problem with it.
Right, because it could turn out that one person knows more than the other person about the situation. And again, but it's when you say stuff like that, I think that people get provoked, and it riles people up a little bit. Again, maybe more non-philosophers than philosophers, since we spend a lot of time dealing with disagreement, philosophical disagreement. That's all the courses are built around philosophical problems, and people disagree endlessly about this stuff, professionals, experts in the field. So we're a lot more comfortable, I think, as a group with disagreement not being something upsetting. We're like just civil, rational, intelligent, discussion about things. But when you get outside the classroom in this context, the idea that, well, wait a minute, are you saying that I'm wrong? And people get upset by it, right? What do you mean I'm wrong? I have my views, and my views are mine. I'm just as entitled to them as you are to yours, and that's being disrespectful. And so that's where all that stuff gets kind of muddled up together, and it makes things really cloudy, which is unfortunate, because, again, I think that questions of tolerance and respect and those are matters of how we treat one another, and they need to be separated out from questions about truth and questions about justification. So, yeah, you can see how you can get an example of R7. He talks about that with the effective treatments example over on 184. And then that brings us down to R8, which is sort of the crux of the whole thing. Feldman's edited an anthology, by the way, on disagreement, which just came out not that long ago. And there's a bunch of essays by different contributors. So it's been a hot topic for a while in epistemology. So the last one here, it's possible for a person to be justified in believing P and justified in believing that other people are justified in believing not P, and not have any reason to believe that his or her own reasons or methods are superior to those of the other people. So this is where we get over to, and then he considers two kind of objections with risky and cautious and the fork in the road examples. So what do people think about R8? Can't have that one. I was not sure. I'm looking over to you because you think it's great. You're a big fan.
Yeah.
Hannah's going to go on record. R6 is good.
Your evidence better than other people's. I don't.
No, that's the thing.
Well, if you apply that to the example where you have the aura around the cup, right?
Yeah.
If the being's method is for forming he had better evidence gathering methods, then in the end of the day, it's just, he's right, and you unfortunately are just lesser than wrong.
No.
You might want to soften it up when you try to sell it, though, right? I mean, I think that's part of it's the attitude or the tone that often comes along with these things. I'm just playing with you. I mean, but I know what you're saying, because you're just kind of cutting to the chase on this. It's like, look, we've got this evidence, and we both agree on what the evidence is, and it's a factual matter, so there's a right or wrong about it, and we're drawing different conclusions, and we're aware of each other's. We've shared everything. So we can't both be right. That's the idea. Yeah.
Yeah, because you're in epistemically similar situations, so like with the aura and the cup thing, and the right thing to do in that situation is to suspend judgment until more testing can occur. And that, because you're right, someone is going to be right, and someone is going to be wrong, but until you have more evidence to support your total evidence, you should suspend judgment.
Well, what's better, just suspending judgment or just believing what you believe?
If someone else is in a similar situation and you're like, yeah, I have my total evidence supports this.
Yeah, so like if there are two different people, I see the cup on the table and you don't, why would I suspend judgment when that's what I believe?
Because if we have if we have similar situations of like we sat down and we're like, okay, hey, this is the reason why I believe this, and you're like,
You've shared everything.
Yeah, we've shared
You're
everything.
epistemic peers.
So we don't,
Yeah.
and I'm like, this is why I believe that, and you're like,
Yeah.
okay, cool, that makes sense to me, but I still believe this. I would just say suspend judgment until more testing.
I guess the idea is that it's going to seem really dogmatic if you just insist that you're going to stick with yours, rather than when you realize that other people that are equally informed and just as smart and just as careful and concerned with the truth, and then you share all that information, to still just say, well, I'm going to stick with what I've got because it's what I've always had, and that seems kind of dogmatic, I guess would be the idea.
Yeah, I don't think that you shouldn't work towards figuring out what the truth is, but why do you have to suspend your belief until that's found? Like, why can't you believe what you believe until that conversation, that evidence is over?
And epistemic conservatism, which is a view we did talk about at one point, would say that, yeah, then in a case like that, stick with what you've already got if it's working for you. But it also seems like epistemic conservatism maybe wasn't such a good idea as a principle. But again,
Isn't there a term for that though? Like when something's strong.
well, counterbalanced or whatever.
Yeah, because the counterbalance shouldn't Yeah.
Right. So keep in mind that a lot of what makes this puzzling and hard is, and it idealizes things a bit, is the stipulation that that each person really does have the same body of evidence. I mean, the cases are, I'm not saying that doesn't happen, and it's very difficult in some situations. Suppose it's a reputed religious experience, and somebody says, well, I've got evidence based on my personal experience. You haven't had that personal experience. And moreover, even you might be able to, if it's a kind of experience that can be had instantiated different ways, different times and places for different people, then maybe it's an experience that would be possible for you to have, but it still wouldn't be that person's experience. It's kind of like you have a headache and I have a headache. We're presumably we both know what a headache feels like, and we can share up to a point in having the same experience, but yours is still private to you. It's yours, and likewise for mine. So, a sort of thing around the periphery of all of this is just the idea of how often does it really come about that people have the exact same evidence for believing something, and then end up disagreeing over it. Seems not that it doesn't happen, but I think that's important to keep in mind. Because a lot of times one way of dealing with a lot of these cases is to say, well, actually, we don't have the same evidence. At the end of the day, we thought we had the same evidence, but we really didn't, especially when it's something of a personal nature. It's very hard. Those are going to be harder things, I think, to get any kind of consensus about or even make sense of the idea of the same in those kind of cases. All right, so what do people think? Everybody convinced that relativism is There's no, well, other than Hannah. There may be some, I mean, no, I think it's fun stuff to think about.
I think it just has, I think the standard view is great, but I think the last 30 of it should be supplemented with those.
Okay, so you want to embrace some sort of relativism on those things because, and I guess in your thinking is that because what counts as evidence there is a lot less clear,
Yes.
and so the idea that maybe we could ever even have the same evidence, throw that into the mix, and it just gets really complicated to try to sort this stuff out. Yeah, the problem is that those are the areas we're most interested in, right? That's philosophy, and that's religion and politics and morality. So that's a lot to have to sort of concede, I think, to the relativist. If you're somebody who's not sympathetic to relativism, you know.
I still think it's like leading you down a trap. It's like walking you down a path and it's saying, yeah, these things, and you're like, okay, the first four, I'm like, yeah, no, I get it, dig it, and then it gets to the end and you're like, oh man, this seems really like, because I can see how this would work in like matters of morality and anything subjective. Like you
Well, it's just an easy way to diffuse a potential argument, and I don't mean a good argument like a philosophical argument in a classroom. I mean episode of Cops kind of argument where people are screaming and yelling at each other. That's what we don't want to have. So that's why people say things like, look, you have your views and I have my views. Let's just agree to disagree. That's a kind of platitude that people throw out. Yeah, Ian?
You mentioned to supplement the religion and morality parts of the standard
Yeah.
review. If you remember, I didn't really approve of those being added in because I well, you mentioned the non-cognitivism thing.
Yeah.
I like that idea because
Yeah.
it doesn't seem to me that they don't have truth values in the same way that
Okay.
our immediate environment, like Section A,
Right.
the standard view, our immediate environment is a chair where the radio is on. The religion, God exists. I don't think you can really. I mean, is there whether God exists or not, is there truth value to that? I mean, if there was, I don't think we can really access that or prove it either way.
Okay. So maybe you think that either it's non-cognitive stuff, it's not factive, or it's stuff we're just going to forever have to suspend judgment on.
Morality and religion, because non-cognitivism,
Yeah.
there's not a truth value.
Yeah.
They're not similar in that way.
Right. So it's either
You
there's.
can't have reasonable disagreement in
Yeah.
areas like our immediate environment or stuff that has a truth value and is easily accessible and you can't have reasonable disagreement there. You can have disagreement in morality and religion, but I don't think they should be part of the standards of the union.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's fair. You might just say, look, I don't think we can have knowledge of those matters either because there are no truth values, they don't express propositions, or if they do express propositions, they're beyond our ability to arrive at a reasonable, so just suspend judgment or something. All righty. Well, thanks, folks. I appreciate it. I've enjoyed it. I hope you have. And I'll end with that.